This is the Kyosho Triumph. It's one of the more rare vintage Kyosho two-wheel drive buggies out there. It preceded the Kyosho Pro X, and I'm not too familiar with the history of this car in terms of like what championships it won or anything like that. But it's an incredibly interesting car because it uses, it looks, well, it has a few interesting features. So one of them is that it has these upper and lower decks, very similar to what you would see in a Nix 91 or a Composite Craft RC10. Those are, it kind of stands out in that sense. The other thing that makes it really interesting is that the gearbox itself is not like a stealth gearbox or even like a Pro X gearbox. It's a belt drive gearbox. So you have an input shaft and a differential down here, and that's it. There's no idler gear. You just have a pulley up here and a pulley down here and a belt that connects them in between. And you can see the opening on the bottom, where you see the belt right there. I think it's actually two belts, one on the left here and one on the right. And it seems to work okay. I tried to do a little bit of research on this chassis to see, to get feedback or to figure out what people who have owned this chassis before have said about it. And generally, people who have owned this chassis back in the 90s, they ended up replacing this gearbox with like an RC10 gearbox, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Maybe they had problems getting it to spin freely or efficiently. But there's quite a lot on this chassis that sort of reminds me of the Kyosho Laser that came out at around the same time. One being the belt drive gearbox, but also the types of wing mounts that are used here. The steering rack. This steering rack is about the same type of aftermarket steering rack that you would use on a Kyosho Laser. So it looks like, maybe they were trying to share some commonality there with the parts. But I just think it's a really cool kit. The slipper clutch as well. Same exact type of slipper clutch you would see on the Kyosho Laser ZXR. This car, I think, came out in 1991 or thereabouts. And given the period of time it came out, the suspension arms are incredibly wide. Right? Look at how narrow the rear of the chassis is. Okay, and then compare that to something like an RC10, which has a much wider rear chassis. And if you may remember, the RC10, you have some mounting holes here for the gearbox, and then the chassis has to be wider to accommodate the inner hinge pin mounts that you thread the hinge pin through that mounts also to the rear suspension arm. So it's a wider chassis, which means the suspension arms have to be shorter. And also, the RC10 had high offset wheels. So, the mounting point for the wheel on the axle was about here, and there was a very deep dish to get out to, say, this kind of width here. But on this chassis, the arms are so wide that, the types of wheels you would use here are very similar to a modern Kyosho buggy. So there's an offset to account for the fact that the hex mount is way out at the outer edge here of the wheel. And then, the wheel goes in to encompass the rest of the suspension. And maybe you can see it here a little bit, maybe a little hard to see. Also, the way that the rear hub carrier mounts onto the suspension arm is you actually have these two little little eyelets, like a shock eyelet here, and then another one over here. And they slot into the arm, and you use these little grub screws to tighten down those little shafts and mount into the arm. So there's not this seems a little too complex or unnecessarily complex, because even if you have this, you still have to mount a hinge pin through those eyelets to get to the rear hub carrier. And by the way, that rear hub carrier is the same rear hub carrier you would see on a vintage Kyosho Laser. So it's a pretty interesting mounting setup for to get the rear hub carrier mounted onto the arms. It's like this extra piece that connects to that. And maybe, I'm not exactly sure why they would do that or what the benefits would be. Oh, I know why they did that. The reason is if you want to adjust toe in, you wouldn't have to buy like a different hinge pin mount or a different hub carrier. You could just, if I wanted more rear toe in, I could basically pull this end out, well, unscrew this, pull this end out, and then re-screw it in on this outer hole here, and that would increase the rear towing. If I wanted toe out, I could go the other way. If I wanted to make the chassis a little wider, I could just move both of these out. So I'm pretty sure it was meant to give you some adjustability for the rear geometry, which is very interesting. But I've never seen anything like this on any other type of buggy. RC10, the Kyosho Pro X, the Schumacher Cougar, the Traxxas TRX3, they never had anything quite like this. The only adjustable rear towing car that I know of was the Tamiya Astute, and that had an extra tie rod with the rear hub carrier kind of pivoting on something, I can't remember what, and you'd adjust the tie rod. It was very, very sloppy. So this gives you a more solid adjustment, but it's a finite adjustment. You can't infinitely adjust the tone. It's just one setting or another. But that's really cool. Again, super, super wide arms, considering, the time that this car was made. I think around 1991 or so. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know quite enough about this car to make any more real statements about it, but I at least wanted to make some kind of introductory video about the Triumph. It's a pretty rare car. Maybe in the future I'll be able to pick up another one and make a runner out of one of them. We'll see. But yeah, it's pretty neat. Thanks for watching.